Now let's look at thoughts around causes of autism. Over the years, there has been much debate around the cause of autism. Before we look at what current science tells us are the causes, let's look at some of outdated theories that have since been proven inaccurate. The term refrigerator mother, or parent, was popularized primarily by the psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim in the 1950s and 1960s, who championed the notion that maternal coldness and a lack of emotional bonding caused autism. The concept originated earlier with psychiatrist Leo Kanner, who, in his seminal 1943 paper describing autism, observed that the parents of the children in his study were often highly educated and intelligent, but seemed distant and lacked warmth. In a 1949 paper, Kanner explicitly referred to children being left neatly in refrigerators which did not defrost, linking parental coldness to the condition. Though Kanner later tried to distance himself from the parent-blaming interpretation, stating the condition was innate, it was Bettelheim who widely disseminated and advocated the refrigerator mother theory to the public and the medical establishment through his books and media appearances. The theory has been long since completely discredited by scientific research, which has shown that autism is a complex neurodevelopmental condition with strong genetic and neurobiological foundations. The efforts of parents, notably Bernard Rimland, the father of an autistic son, were instrumental in challenging the theory and reorienting research toward biological causes. Now let's look at controversial link between the MMR inoculation and autism. Andrew Wakefield, a former senior surgeon, falsely claimed a link between the measles, mumps, and rubella MMR vaccine and autism. The publicity surrounding the study caused a sharp decline in vaccination uptake, leading to a number of outbreaks of measles around the world and many deaths as a result. Wakefield published his 1998 paper on autism in the British medical journal The Lancet, claiming to have identified a novel form of enterocolitis linked to autism. However, other researchers were unable to reproduce his findings, and a 2004 investigation by Sunday Times reporter Brian Deere identified undisclosed financial conflicts of interest on Wakefield's part. Wakefield reportedly stood to earn up to $43 million per year selling test kits. Most of Wakefield's co-authors then withdrew their support for the study's interpretations, and the General Medical Council, GMC, conducted an inquiry into allegations of misconduct against Wakefield and two former colleagues, focusing on Deere's findings. In 2010, the GMC found that Wakefield had been dishonest in his research, had acted against patients' best interests, mistreated developmentally delayed children, and had failed in his duties as a responsible consultant. The Lancet fully retracted Wakefield's 1998 publication on the basis of the GMC's findings, noting that elements of the manuscript had been falsified and that the journal had been deceived by Wakefield. 3 months later, Wakefield was struck off the UK Medical Register, in part for his deliberate falsification of research published in The Lancet. In a related legal decision, a British court held that there is now no respectable body of opinion which supports Wakefield's hypothesis that MMR vaccine and autism/enterocolitis are causally linked. So we have looked at the controversial theories relating to autism. Now let's look at what we currently know to be true. Korshane et al., 2007, Ecker et al., 2015, confirm that autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, which means it begins during brain development, before a child is even born. Studies of identical twins show that autism often runs in families because of genetics. Genes play a big part. We now know of hundreds linked to autism. Tick et al., 2016. Sandin et al., 2017. Many are involved in how the brain forms, how neurons connect, and how the brain regulates itself. Satterstrom et al., 2020. For some children, the genetic differences are inherited. For others, they happen randomly as cells divide, what scientists call de novo mutations. Either way, it is biological. Brain scans show that autistic children's brains grow differently. Some parts are larger, some areas are more connected, while others are less. Ames and Katani, 2015. The brain quite literally processes the world in a different way. Not wrong, just different. Humphreys, Minshew, Berman, and Cebu 2006 took neuroimaging of autistic and neurotypical brain. In the image shown, you can clearly see the brain difference between the red brain, which is the autistic brain, versus the blue, which is the neurotypical image. It is important to note that all autistic brains do not look identical to the one shown. Research has shown that autistic people often have different brain sizes in early development. Korshan et al., 2001. Changes in how different parts of the brain talk to each other. Udin et al., 2013. Imbalances in the brain's chemistry, especially with serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. Horder et al., 2018. Pizzarelli and Cherubini, 2018. 2011. Differences in how the immune system works, both in the body and the brain. Estes and McAllister, 2015. Rose et al., 2012. None of this can be explained by parenting. It is physical. It is biological. It is real. If you have been told you need to try harder or do better as a parent, please know this. Why this matters. Aaron York from acceptingbehavior.com writes, autism is not a result of poor discipline, lack of social exposure, or too much affection, or not enough. These ideas are outdated and harmful. Instead, your child's behavior is a reflection of how their brain processes information, sensory input, emotion, and stress. It might look like defiance or avoidance, but often it is simply survival. Garcia Dominguez et al., 2021. If we understand that autism is biological, we stop blaming families and start asking what support a child really needs. Steve Silberman said, by autistic standards, the normal brain is easily distractible, is obsessively social, and suffers from a deficit of attention to detail and routine. My favorite quote about autism come from Tony Atwood, and he said, it's as though autistic people have something more enjoyable to do than socialize. I can relate totally to this quote, being an autistic person myself. However, remember than not, everyone who is autistic is exactly the same. Another way of looking at difference is to use a comparative example. For instance, think of neurotypicals as being iPhones and autistic individuals as being Android. We look the same, and yet our operating systems are slightly different. You could say neurotypicals are like dogs, and autistic individuals are like cats. I like this reference because Kathy Hoopman wrote a book called All Cats Have Asperger's Syndrome. And if you stick with this example, if you have a dog and you come back from work, they get excited as if to say, how was your day? Tell me all about it. However, autistic kids are a lot like cats, and when they see you, it's like, oh, it's you. I'll be back when I want my dinner. And then they disappear upstairs until food is ready. Kieran, who goes by the online name of the Autistic Advocate, says, an autistic brain works differently and functions differently to a neurotypical brain. If you try to make one brain work like the other, it's the equivalent of putting diesel into a petrol engine. It works for a while and then comes to a grinding and sputtering halt. One of the things you often hear from relatives is, we didn't have autism in my day. Okay, let's briefly look at this. First of all, anyone with a learning disability would have been locked away, so that group was hidden from society. And secondly, individuals without a learning disability would have been our teachers, working in factories, doing any work that was repetitive, or scientists. In Steve Silberman's book, Neurotribes, he identifies a lot of scientists back in the day were probably autistic. In the world of science, it's acceptable to be different. For the final part of this session, let's look at the benefits of diagnosis. To be clear, some autistic people never obtain a proper diagnosis and still manage to live full and capable lives. However, most autistic individuals will benefit from a proper diagnosis, as receiving it helps giving the individual a proper explanation of their condition, which in turn can bring a sense of relief for both the individual and their family. Allow access to services they would otherwise not be entitled to or aware of. Bring about a better understanding of how to deal with any problems they may experience, or give families access to a range of financial help, and get them directed to a range of approaches that may help them to cope. Some people will argue, you shouldn't label people or labels only belong on jars. Here's my take on receiving a diagnosis. An autism diagnosis puts the individual under the protection of the Disability Discrimination Act, which in turn means that employers have to make reasonable adjustments to ensure the well-being of their autistic staff. However, with no diagnosis, no flexibility has to be given. Unfortunately, this is also true of children of a school age. In the UK, unless the child receives a diagnosis, then the school do not have to make any accommodations or adjustments. To end today's session, I want to leave you with a quote from Seren, the AUDHD aerialist, who says, "Undiagnosed neurodivergence is like being handed a video game that has been set to hard mode, but having people tell you over and over, 'It's on easy, why do you keep dying?' Diagnosis is learning the game is on hard mode. It doesn't make it easier, but you can strategize." And that brings us to the end of today's session. I hope this exploration of diagnosis, the science, the myths, the lived experience, has given you clarity and comfort. Next time, we'll dive deep into social communication differences and what they look like in everyday life. Thank you so much for listening to Autism Unfiltered. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and be kind to difference.